electric buses are a bad idea. They might have their niche applications, but generally we shouldn't be moving in this direction, not with the alternatives available to us. Now, what makes me say that? To understand the issue with electric buses, let's take a look at atmospheric rail. It was a real novelty originating from as far back as 1799, according to the wiki page anyway. The idea was that locomotives are bulky and heavy, they're a pain to maintain, they need coal, water, sand, and so on, so why not have one big quote-unquote locomotive next to the tracks which propels trains on the network while stationary. In practice, this meant big boiler houses that pumped steam into a big pipe between the rails, to which carriages were connected with a piston. As the steam flew through the pipe, it propelled the train forward. The early projects all failed, however, due to the technological shortcomings at the time. The biggest issue was the sealing of the pipes. They used leather flaps which froze during winter and dried out during summer, rendering the whole system unusable in both cases. Turns out, steam locomotives are just more practical, since you don't have to pay attention to kilometers of piping if you want to run a train. Now, normally this would be the point where I would say, and so the atmospheric railway concept was abandoned in favor of better solutions. But it kinda wasn't, not since we've invented electric traction. Today's catenaries are essentially a form of the atmospheric railway. Only instead of a steam plant pumping steam into a pipe, we have an electric plant pumping electricity into a wire. This way we don't have to generate the electricity on the tracks, i.e. diesel locomotives. This might be a surprise to some, but it's not the diesel locomotive's engine that moves it forward. The engine is spinning a generator which then powers the electric motors which then move the train. With catenaries, you can get rid of the engine, which means more efficiency, power, and capacity. Alright, so how does all of this tie into electric buses? Well, electric buses do the same thing as catenary-based systems and the atmospheric rail, except in reverse. Electric buses are basically trolleybuses with a local power source. Of course, this does make them flexible, i.e. they can go everywhere without an overhead wire, but here's the thing, where will they actually go? You see, electric buses are mainly used inside cities, and city bus lines have this attribute of not changing their routes, i.e. the bus will run on the same route 99.9999% of the time. So if we know the exact path of the bus in advance, why not just put up some wires above that route? That way we don't have to mess with the heavy batteries weighing down the bus, not to mention the enormous safety hazard. You know how electric cars tend to basically burn to ash when the battery catches fire? Electric buses can do the same, except with a battery multiple times the size. Speaking of batteries, their construction and disposal are very polluting, not to mention the occasional slave labor involved in the mining of the necessary rare earth metals. A further problem is that electric buses aren't a good option where public transit is needed the most, i.e. developing countries. Electric buses are much more expensive, as it turns out, costing up to twice as much as diesel buses. So a country or a city with limited funds can either buy, say, 500 electric buses or 1000 diesel buses. Now, electric buses are generally cheaper to operate, so they would save money in the long run. But during that time, you only have 50% capacity since you're running 500 buses instead of 1000. That means potentially tens of thousands of cars stay on the road, hundreds of thousands of people will not have access to good public transit, and so on. Especially in developing countries, this can cause losses much greater than any cost savings by electric buses. Since potentially hundreds of thousands of people won't have access to high-capacity, affordable public transit, this will very likely set them back economically, which means a major tax loss for the local authorities. You know, someone living in a shantytown could have finally taken a job in another area of the city, since they could have actually commuted there with the bus. They would have made a salary, which they would have spent at businesses, boosting the local economy and increasing tax revenue. But if we get half as many buses, we won't be able to provide affordable transit for a lot of people, meaning they'll stay at home on welfare at best or contribute to an increasing crime rate at worst. I can guarantee you that the combined cost of additional welfare and policing and the missing tax revenue will be a much greater amount than any savings electric buses might bring. So if the priority is cost and capacity, diesel buses win hands down. Otherwise, as I've mentioned before, we can just put up some wires and run a trolleybus service instead. And to all the NIMBYs out there, trolleybus wires aren't big or ugly or visually polluting. Here's an image of Dohány Street in Budapest where trolleybuses run. As you can see, the wires are barely visible. So trolleybuses are all well and good as an alternative, but what if the wires break or if there's an accident and they need to take a detour? I have good news. We've already solved this problem in the form of autonomous trolleybuses. This means the trolleybus has a small battery or diesel generator inside that allows it to run without a wire, usually between 10 and 30 kilometers. This way they can bypass accident sites or reach areas without overhead wires, thus solving the flexibility issue. Now, some people might say, okay, so it works inside cities, that's nice, but we can't possibly put up all these wires between cities. To which I say, yes we can. They're called trains. And if the distance is too short for trains to make sense, then trams. Or if the distance is too short for trains but too long for trams, then tram trains. So no matter how we flip it, electric buses just don't make a whole lot of sense. Inside cities it's better to use diesel or trolleybuses, and outside cities it's better to have rail. Of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, there can be some niche applications for electric buses, but they are just that. So the whole concept of electric buses as we apply it today is pretty dumb. And I actually have the same opinion about battery powered powered trains. It's just a way for our decision makers to not invest into rail, i.e. proper electrification. Instead, they can and will use the money to build more highways, for example. And why wouldn't they? Most of them only use their cars and will die before climate change really hits us. And that will be our problem, not theirs. In summary, aside from some niche applications, electric buses are not the solution to anything. They're mostly just a way for cities to quickly check the environmentally friendly box and then go back to their unsustainable car-centric practices without the necessary systemic investments into public transit and better urban planning. Or in the best case scenario, they're just cute little PR stunts. Oh look, we get some electric buses. Now 1.27% of our entire bus fleet is electric powered. Climate change BTFO'd. Anyway, thank you for watching and don't forget to like and subscribe. And I also have a Patreon if you think this content is worth your money. And I'll be seeing you next time.